Bosby Shaw also noted some not so pleasant comments, or made some not so pleasant comments about the locals. He said that Hatteras was, quote, inhabited by hardy, raw-boned, tough-looking people with rough, weather-beaten countenances, possessed of a good stock of native shrewdness. He noted that the chief disease was consumption, that the women were, quote, pale, frail, attenuated creatures who apparently never grow old, unquote. He said, rather they, quote again, gradually shrink up and at some remote period are just blown away, unquote. He was rather amazed by the fact that the women smoked and could spit like men. And he said they also were addicted to snuff dipping, but instead of putting a piece of snuff between the teeth and jaws, they used a brush to paint it on their teeth, resulting in blackened teeth and what he called foul breath. Anyway, others reported, one correspondent from the New York Times quoted, and this is probably my favorite one of all, quote, queer folks in this region, several hundred are scattered along the bar who get their living by fishing, gathering oysters, wrecking, and piloting. Most of them were born here, never saw any other locality, and all are happy. There are women here who never wore shoes. So that kind of gives you a sense of, you know, what others thought about the place. Now, the reminiscences of Joseph Gould of the 48th Pennsylvania were a bit more mixed. He recorded that his first impressions of Hatteras weren't that great, but then he says, later, quote, we learned to love the old place in time, and often in our experiences we wished we were back with old Caleb Stowe, Captain Balance, Baldy Austin, Polly Miller, and the rest of them, who took us duck hunting and fishing and baked corn pones for us, unquote. And there is quite a bit of evidence that some of the local residents were in fact quite cordial to the Northern soldiers. They visited together, the soldiers visited in their homes, they reported eating dinner with them, joining them to make pulled candy, flirting with the local girls, and in post-war reminiscences, as I noticed, they wrote warmly of some of the people they had met while on Hatteras. The interesting thing is I have yet to find any indication of any mixing between the local whites and any of the contrabands or later freedmen, so unfortunately I can't report anything about those. Whether they were social encounters or day-to-day encounters. I know we'll talk about their encounters, the encounters between the free people and the soldiers themselves. After the war opened, the local whites traded freely with both Confederates and Unionists, and I'm probably crossing over with what Drew said this morning to talk a little bit about that as background. Like citizens in the other parts of eastern North Carolina, they were apparently opportunists in their allegiances. When the Confederates were building the fortifications on Hatteras, the locals traded with them. Once the Union had taken over Hatteras, some of them were apparently very worried about what would happen to them, and some complained about Union mistreatment, but most took the oath of allegiance to the Union. In his recent book about the Union occupation in eastern North Carolina, Judkin Browning calls this sort of shifting, quote, flexible loyalties. Colonel Rush C. Hawkins wrote that, quote, within 10 days after the landing, nearly all of the male adults at Hatteras had taken the oath of allegiance, unquote. How strong their sentiments were, we'll never know. Many of the men did enlist in the Union's 1st North Carolina Regiment, but modern historians question whether that was solely because of their sympathy for the cause. Surely the locals also realized that if the Confederates recaptured Hatteras, those who had sworn allegiance to the Union would pay a swift price, so it behooved them to help the Union maintain control. Whatever the case, there's evidence that once the locals had reassurances from the Union officers that the soldiers would refrain from looting, they quickly learned to live with and even benefit from the Union occupation. Reports indicate that the escaped slaves started arriving at the Union camp in Hatteras shortly after the Union takeover. Some were from Hatteras, some from the mainland, some from Roanoke Island. In contrast to the Roanoke Island freedmen, the majority of which were taken to the island by the Union Army after raids in eastern North Carolina and after the fall of Plymouth, it appears that a majority of the freedmen got to Hatteras on their own. While some contemporaries perpetuated the rather romantic and somewhat patronizing notion that all contrabands follow the North Star to freedom, it is much more likely that those who came east or south to Hatteras got there because of their very sophisticated skills in navigating the local waters. Some of the contrabands arriving from Roanoke Island reported that their owners had told them that if they went to Hatteras, the Yankees would sell their young and able blacks to Cuba and then cripple and cut off the right arms of the old men. Apparently they all just nodded in agreement, all the while planning their escapes. Many had grown used to seeing Northerners on Roanoke Island buying shad, and they knew they were very friendly. There were also also some daring stories of escapes from northern counties and from Plymouth. According to a correspondent of the New York Commercial Advertiser, one group of 5 or 6 from the north arrived on Hatteras in January 1862, quote, gaunt with hunger, exhausted by fatigue, and in rags, unquote. They had spent 5 or 6 weeks in the woods, living off of roots and berries, and managed to steal a boat. Coming down the eastern side of Roanoke Island, they were hailed by Confederate sentinels. They pretended to stop rowing and let the boat drift by the centuries, at which point they started rowing like mad. The Confederates fired several shots on them, but no one was hit, and they made it to Hatteras. Some of the slaves from Roanoke Island gave very useful information about the location of the Confederate fortifications on Roanoke Island. William Derby of the 27th Massachusetts related that on January 1862, a schooner carrying wood to Hatteras had on board 3 contrabands. One gave information that helped make the plan of attack on Roanoke, and he served as a guide to the Union forces. As noted earlier, the first part of this talk came from an article about the extended Tillett family that had come to Hatteras from Roanoke Island in the fall of 1861. The family consisted of Franklin, age 68, and his wife, age 65, and their 17 children, who had come to Hatteras by boat. They were featured in articles in both the New York Times and the National Anti-Slavery Standard. The writer in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, in fact, must have spent a lot of time with them. His description is much longer and much more detailed. He reported actually talking with them in their cabins about what would happen if they returned to their owners. And they declared that, quote, they would never, never, never return to Roanoke in slavery, unquote. Even though the enslaved people on Roanoke Island generally had a lot more freedom than those on the mainland, they still were not free. Surely it must have galled Franklin and Nancy that many of their children didn't even have the Tillett surname. The writer for the National Anti-Slavery Standard noted that the children were 4 surnames. There were 5 Tilletts, 4 Daniels, 1 Drinkwater, and 7 Ashbys. The correspondent to the New York Times reported that the Tillett clan were, quote, very expert boatmen and are useful in pulling about the inlet and working along the shore, unquote. The 5th Tillett son, known on Hatteras as Old Ben Tillett, was, quote, a skillful inland sailor, knows all about the inlets and outlets, the winds and the currents, the moon and the tides, and would be a very useful man on a coast survey, unquote. In my book about the Roanoke Island Freedman's colony, I speculate that this Old Ben was the same Old Ben mentioned by Charles F. Johnson, a soldier in the 9th New York, who took part in the Roanoke Island battle. Johnson recorded that Old Ben spent the night before the attack of Roanoke Island at Burnside's headquarters, giving information about the different works on the island. Burnside himself gave credit to another young slave escapee from Roanoke Island named Thomas R. Robinson, who had been owned by a man named Joseph M. Daniels. Robinson's knowledge of Roanoke Island helped guide Lieutenant W.S. Andrews, Burnside's topographical engineer, to suggest the landing at Ashby's Harbor. Oddly enough, not all of the contrabands who made it to Hatteras were running away from their owners. In February 1862, the New York Times reported on the arrival of 4 black men from Middletown in Hyde County. According to the paper, they indicated that they, quote, belonged to a good Union man near Middletown and that they had been advised to make their escape, unquote, to avoid Confederate impressment. Their master sent a message with them asking the Union to hurry up and send steamers to Middletown. Sometimes we forget how strong the Union sentiment was in parts of eastern North Carolina, and we also forget that many Southern Unionists didn't see any contradiction between supporting the Union cause and owning slaves, especially in the first 2 years